Some of the tiny details in a news story become something else entirely when you slow down long enough to really look at them. A 2-year-old girl, a father who never stopped searching, a cold case that sat in a file drawer for nearly a quarter century, and then one detective, one database, and one DNA test that changed everything. Her name in this story is Camilla, and this is what we know. The city of Harwick, Connecticut, sits about 40 miles from the coast, wedged between two larger towns that most people outside the state have never heard of. It is the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where the same families have lived on the same streets for 3 and 4 generations, where a missing child becomes the kind of wound a community carries for decades without ever fully healing. On October 19, 1999, a little girl named Camilla Vega disappeared from Harwick. She was 2 years old. She had her father's dark eyes and a laugh that, according to people who knew her, could fill up a room. She did not wander off. She was not taken by a stranger in the dark. She was taken by her own mother, and for the next 25 years, she was gone. In this video, we're going to walk through what we know about the disappearance of Camilla Vega, the investigation that stalled for 2 decades, the cold case detective who refused to let it die, and the extraordinary moment more than 2.5 decades later when a father finally heard his daughter's voice again. This story is going to take us from the quiet streets of Harwick, Connecticut, all the way to a city of over 1 million people deep inside Mexico. It is going to take us through courtrooms and border crossings, through social media profiles and DNA laboratories, through years of silence and one man's stubborn, heartbreaking refusal to stop looking. Before we get into it, if you're new here and you find yourself pulled into cases like this one, where the investigation stretches across years and continents and the answers come from the most unexpected places, please consider subscribing. We cover stories that deserve more attention than they get, and we try to tell them with the care and seriousness they require. Hit the like button too if you want this kind of content to reach more people. It genuinely makes a difference. Okay, let us go back to 1999. Harwick, Connecticut, in the fall of 1999, was, by most accounts, an ordinary place living through an ordinary time. The country was still riding the long economic expansion of the late 90s. The leaves were turning. People were going to work, coming home, making dinner. For a man named Eduardo Vega, that ordinary fall was about to end in a way he could never have anticipated. Eduardo, who friends and family describe as a quiet, hard-working man, had been through a difficult separation from his daughter's mother, a woman we will call Marisol throughout this episode. The relationship had ended badly. There had been disputes, legal filings, the kind of messy and painful unraveling that happens between two people who once built something together and then couldn't figure out how to stop tearing it apart. But there was one thing that had been settled, at least on paper. Eduardo had legal custody of Camilla. Marisol did not. The court had made that determination, and whatever the reasons were, whatever the arguments made on both sides, that was the decision that stood. Camilla lived with her father. Eduardo was raising her. He was the one getting up in the night, making the bottles, learning the rhythms of a toddler's unpredictable world. And then, on October 19, 1999, Marisol took her. The exact circumstances of that day are something we will come back to, but what matters in the immediate sense is this: Camilla was gone. Eduardo came home or came to pick up his daughter from an arrangement that had been made, and she was not there. Marisol was not there. Nothing was there except the absence, which is somehow always louder than anything else. He called, no answer. He went to Marisol's relatives. No one would say where she had gone, or no one knew. He drove around Harwick in the dark, checking the places that made sense, then the places that didn't, then the places where you go when you have run out of ideas and panic has replaced reason. By the time he called the Harwick Police Department, it had been hours. The officer who took the initial report noted the key facts. Mother had no legal custody. Father had full legal custody. Child was 2 years old. Mother was believed to have taken the child. No known destination. Somewhere in Mexico, a little girl was growing up. She had a name, though we do not know what name she was using by then. She had a life, a school, a neighborhood, a language that had become her first. She had whatever story Marisol had told her about who she was and where she came from. And here is one of the most quietly devastating questions this case raises. Did Camila know? Did she know at any point in her childhood or adolescence that there was a father in Connecticut who had never stopped looking for her? Or had she been given a story that had no room in it for Eduardo at all? We do not know the answer to that question with certainty. What we do know is that by the time she was found, she was an adult living her own life in a country she had grown up in, with her own relationships and her own sense of who she was. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before we get to the finding, we have to understand the turning point. We have to understand how a case that had been cold for nearly 2 decades came back to life. In 2023, more than 23 years after Camila's disappearance, a detective at the Harwick Police Department named Nadia Kellstrom was assigned to review cold cases involving missing minors. The Harwick PD, like many departments across the country, had made a push in the early 2020s to revisit old files with fresh eyes, and more importantly, with new tools. The forensic landscape had changed dramatically in the years since 1999. Genetic genealogy, the technique that had cracked open cold cases across the country, including some that had been dormant for 30 and 40 years, had become a legitimate investigative tool. Social media had created an entirely different kind of digital trail. Databases had grown, merged, and become more powerful in ways that investigators in 1999 could not have imagined. Detective Kellstrom pulled the Vega file. By all accounts, it was not a thin file. Eduardo had kept filing updates, submitting new information whenever he had it, and the original investigation had generated significant documentation. But the active leads had dried up long ago, and for years the file had sat waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet. Kellstrom later described the case as one that stayed with her from the first time she read it. There was something about it, she said, that felt unfinished in a way that went beyond the usual frustration of a cold case. A 2-year-old, a father with full legal custody, a mother who had simply taken her across a border and vanished. She started from the beginning. The first tool she turned to was one that would have been unthinkable in 1999: social media. By 2023, platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and others had become, in certain kinds of investigations, something close to an open directory. People who had been careful for years about their physical location were sometimes far less careful about their digital one. They posted photographs, they tagged locations, they connected with family members, they left traces. Detective Kellstrom and her team began building a picture. They started with Marisol's known family members and associates from the original investigation. Some of those people had online presences. Those presences connected to other presences. Carefully and methodically, following the links through the social graph the way a detective follows a paper trail, they began to narrow things down. It took months. It was not a linear process. There were dead ends and false positives, and moments where a promising thread turned out to lead nowhere. But the picture kept getting sharper. And at some point in 2023, the picture led them to a city called Verano, a city of more than 1 million people, deep in central Mexico. That discovery, if you can call it that at that stage, because they still did not have confirmation, because they still had a name and a general location, but not a face and not a certainty, that discovery changed the direction of the entire case. But here is where things got complicated in a way that no amount of social media research could resolve on its own. The woman they believed might be Camila, now in her mid-20s, had grown up in Mexico. She had a life there. She presumably did not know or did not know fully the circumstances of how she had come to be there. Reaching out to her directly, if they had the wrong person, could cause real harm to an innocent person. And even if they had the right person, the situation required an extraordinary degree of care. This was not a criminal to be arrested. This was a young woman who had been taken as a toddler and raised in another country. Whatever her experience had been, however she understood her own identity, the last thing anyone wanted was to blow into her life with an accusation and a subpoena. The Harwick PD reached out to a forensic DNA company, a lab called Arden Genomics, that had been working with law enforcement agencies across the country on exactly these kinds of cases. Specifically, cases involving unidentified or missing individuals, where traditional investigative methods had run out of road. Within 24 hours, the Harwick PD had escalated the case. Because this was a parental abduction involving a custody violation, and because there was reason to believe Marisol intended to leave the country, the FBI became involved within the first week. A federal warrant was issued for Marisol's arrest. Her name and Camilla's name were entered into the National Crime Information Center database, the system that law enforcement agencies across the country use to track missing persons and fugitives. Camila Vega, age 2, date of birth noted, last seen October 19, 1999 in Harwick, Connecticut. That entry would sit in that system for nearly 25 years. In the early weeks of the investigation, there were leads. There are always leads in the beginning. Marisol had family in several states, and detectives followed those threads. There were phone records pulled, interviews conducted, surveillance footage reviewed at bus terminals and airports. One early and significant piece of intelligence came from a family member who, according to later accounts, told investigators that Marisol had talked before the disappearance about going to Mexico. She had family there. She had ties there that went back before she had ever come to Connecticut. The suggestion, even in those early days, was that she had not just fled across a state line, she had left the country entirely. The FBI took that seriously. There were international channels activated, communications sent to Mexican authorities through the appropriate diplomatic and law enforcement pathways. But here is where the difficulty begins, and it is a difficulty that investigators dealing with international parental abduction cases will tell you is one of the most frustrating realities of this kind of work. Finding someone in another country, especially someone who is not using their legal name, who has support systems in place, who knows how to stay quiet, who has no reason to make themselves visible, is extraordinarily hard. It was hard in 1999. The tools available were a fraction of what exists today. Social media did not exist. DNA forensic genealogy did not exist. The digital footprint that people leave now, every photograph tagged, every profile created, every platform joined, simply was not there. In 1999, if you wanted to disappear, you could disappear, especially if you had somewhere to go and people willing to help you get there. Eduardo Vega went to Mexico himself, more than once. Friends and family in those early years after the disappearance have described him as a man consumed by the search, someone who spent his savings, took unpaid leave from work, traveled to cities and towns where he had heard rumors, followed up on tips that went nowhere, knocked on doors that didn't open. He did not find Camilla. He did not find Marisol. He came home each time to Harwick, to the house that still had his daughter's things in it, to the silence that does not leave. By the middle of the 2000s, the case had what investigators call a stall. The active leads had been exhausted. The witnesses who might have known something either moved, stopped talking, or had nothing new to offer. The file did not close. It never officially closed, but the daily attention that a case gets in its early days simply could not be sustained indefinitely. Not with limited resources, not with new cases coming in, not with the practical realities of how law enforcement agencies have to allocate their time. Camilla's name stayed in the database. Eduardo kept searching on his own. The years passed. 2003, 2007, 2012. Eduardo Vega spent those years as a man walking through his own life at a slight remove, doing the things that life requires, working, keeping up with friends and family, existing. But anyone who knew him well would tell you that there was a part of him that never came back from October 19, 1999. That part of him was still in the car, still driving through Harwick in the dark, still looking for his daughter. People who experience what Eduardo experienced, the sudden, unexplained loss of a child to a parental abduction, often describe it as a grief that has no clean shape. When someone dies, the grief is devastating, but it has a form. There is a before and an after, a terrible clarity. When a child is taken and no one knows where they are, the grief is different. It lives in the uncertainty. It lives in the question that never gets answered. Is she okay? Is she safe? Does she know I'm looking for her? Does she even know I exist? Camilla would have turned 5 in 2002. She would have started school. She would have been 10 in 2007. Navigating the particular chaos of a preteen life, whatever version of that life she was living in a place Eduardo didn't know. She would have turned 15 in 2012, the age when most young people are somewhere between childhood and whatever comes next, forming the version of themselves they will carry into adulthood. Eduardo was not there for any of it. He had not chosen that absence, but he lived with it the way you live with a wound that never quite heals, always present, always aching, always there when the room got quiet. Arden Genomics had developed protocols for exactly this kind of situation. How to approach a potential match sensitively, how to collect a DNA sample legally and voluntarily, how to use advanced genealogical testing to establish or rule out a biological relationship with a degree of certainty that holds up in court. The plan, once it was put together, required coordination between the Harwick PD, the FBI, the DNA lab, and ultimately Mexican authorities, who would need to be part of any approach made on their sovereign territory. And it required Eduardo Vega to provide a DNA sample of his own, which he did immediately, without hesitation, the same day he was asked. He had been waiting 24 years for someone to ask him something he could actually do. The process that followed was not quick. There were legal channels to navigate, diplomatic considerations to manage, and the fundamental challenge of making contact with a woman in another country who may or may not have known anything about any of this. Detective Kellstrom later described the period between the initial identification in 2023 and the eventual confirmation as one of the most professionally and personally demanding stretches of her career. They had reason to believe, they had a strong working theory, but they did not have certainty, and without certainty, every step had to be measured. Meanwhile, Eduardo had been told that there was a development in the case, that investigators believed they had located someone who might be his daughter. He was told this carefully, with appropriate caveats, because the last thing anyone wanted was to give a man who had been searching for 24 years a hope that then turned out to be wrong. He later said that the night he was told, he sat in his kitchen for a long time without moving. He did not know what to feel. He had imagined this moment so many times over so many years that when it actually arrived, it did not feel the way he had expected it to. It felt more fragile, more real, more terrifying. Because what if it was her? What would he say? Would she know him? Would she want to know him? And just as urgently, what if it wasn't? The answer was still weeks away. The coordination was still ongoing. The DNA results were still being processed. And in a city of 1 million people in central Mexico, a young woman was going about her life, not yet knowing that a detective in Connecticut had found a thread that led back to a 2-year-old girl who had vanished on October 19, 1999. Not yet knowing that the thread led to her. The DNA results came back on a Thursday. Detective Kellstrom later said she remembers the exact moment she opened the report, sitting at her desk in the Harwick PD with a cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. The language of forensic genetics is precise and clinical, built to withstand courtroom scrutiny, designed to leave no room for misinterpretation. But the conclusion at the bottom of that report was clear enough that you did not need a science degree to understand what it meant. The probability of a biological father-daughter relationship between Eduardo Vega and the young woman in Verano, Mexico exceeded 99.9%. She was Camila. She had been there, in that city of more than 1 million people for most of her life. She had grown up speaking Spanish as her first language. She had gone to school there, made friends there, built whatever version of adulthood she was building in that place. She was 26 years old by the time the results came back. She had been 2 years old when she was taken from Harwick, Connecticut on October 19, 1999. 24 years. That is the distance between a toddler laughing in a house in a small Connecticut city and a grown woman living a full life in central Mexico who did not completely understand until strangers started making careful inquiries that the story she had been given about herself was not the whole story. Let us slow down here for a moment because the path between the initial identification and the DNA confirmation is one of the most carefully managed and logistically complex parts of this entire case, and it deserves to be understood properly. By the time Detective Kellstrom and her team had developed what they believed was a credible identification in Verano, they had already been working the case for months. The social media research, the interviews, the legal process of obtaining search warrants for digital records, all of that had taken time. It had taken patience, and it had produced something that looked to experienced investigators like a real answer. But looking like an answer and being an answer are different things. And the difference matters enormously when the subject of your investigation is not a fugitive you were trying to apprehend, but potentially a young woman who was taken from her home before she had any capacity to understand what was happening to her. The investigators who work these kinds of cases, international parental abductions that have stretched across decades, will tell you that the recovery phase is not the end of the work. In many ways, it is the beginning of the most sensitive and difficult work of all. Because you are not just solving a case, you are entering someone's life. You are arriving with information that has the potential to fundamentally destabilize everything that person believes about themselves and their own history. And you have to do it carefully, because if you get it wrong or if you handle it clumsily, the damage you can cause to that person is real and lasting. The Harwick PD and the FBI, working through established diplomatic and law enforcement channels, made contact with Mexican authorities. That process required documentation, formal requests, careful coordination across jurisdictions and across a language barrier, and the navigation of the specific protocols that govern cooperation between U.S. and Mexican law enforcement. None of that happens overnight. None of it should. The approach to Camila, when it was finally made, was handled by Mexican authorities with American support. The initial conversation was not framed as an accusation or an arrest, it was framed as an inquiry. There were questions about her background, her identity, her knowledge of her own history. The people who spoke with her were trained in exactly this kind of situation, and by all accounts they handled it with the care it required. Camila did not immediately agree to the DNA test. That is worth saying clearly and without judgment. Of course she did not immediately agree. She was a 26-year-old woman being told by law enforcement officials from 2 countries that there were questions about who she was. Questions that, if they led where the investigators believed they led, would mean that her entire understanding of her own origin was built on something that had been constructed for her without her knowledge or consent. She asked questions, she took time, she consulted with people she trusted. She processed the information through whatever framework was available to her, in whatever private way made sense to her. And eventually, after a period of several weeks, she agreed to provide a DNA sample voluntarily. Eduardo provided his sample the same day investigators asked him to, without hesitation, without conditions. He had been waiting 24 years for a door to open, and when this one did, he walked through it immediately. The samples went to Arden Genomics. The processing began. And then came the weeks that Kellstrom described as the hardest waiting of the entire investigation. She had spent months rebuilding this case from scratch. She had followed threads across social media platforms and through genealogical databases and across an international border. She had coordinated with federal agencies and foreign law enforcement. She had managed the expectations of a father who had been carrying this weight since 1999. She had done everything she could do, and now there was nothing to do but wait for a laboratory result. Eduardo, for his part, was doing what he had always done during the hardest stretches of the search. He was existing. He was going through the motions of his daily life, working and eating and sleeping, or trying to sleep, while the part of him that had never fully come home from October 19, 1999, sat with the possibility that this time might be different. He has said in the limited accounts that have been shared publicly that he tried to not let himself believe fully, that he had been close before or thought he had been close, and the distance between close and confirmed broke him in ways that took a long time to recover from. He had learned over 24 years to protect himself from the specific cruelty of hope that does not arrive. But he could not entirely shut it out. The sample had been collected. The test was underway. Somewhere in a laboratory, a scientist was looking at his DNA and her DNA and asking the question that his whole adult life had been organized around. Is she his? The answer came back on a Thursday. Detective Kellstrom read the report. She verified the result with a second set of eyes. She made contact with the FBI. She made the necessary documentation entries. She did everything that the protocol required in the order that it required it. And then she called Eduardo Vega. She has described that call in careful terms in the time since. She said she had thought about what she would say. She had prepared for different scenarios, rehearsed the words for both a positive and a negative result, because a detective who has done this work long enough knows that you have to be ready for both, no matter what you believe the answer is going to be. She told him the test had come back. She told him the probability figure. She told him that the young woman in Verano, Mexico, was his daughter. Eduardo was not alone when the call came. A family member, a sister, was with him in the house. People who were in that room have described what happened in the moments after Kellstrom delivered the news in ways that are difficult to translate into language that does it justice. Eduardo made a sound, they said, that was unlike anything they had heard from him before. It was not quite crying, not quite speaking, something between the two that is only available to a person who has just been given back something they had been certain, at various points over many years, they would never get back. 24 years. He had been 29 years old when Camila was taken. He was 53 when the call came. She had been 2. She was 26. Nearly his entire adult life had been defined, at least in part, by the fact of her absence and by his refusal to accept that absence as permanent. And now she was found. The reunion, the actual face-to-face or voice-to-voice contact between Eduardo and his daughter did not happen immediately after the DNA confirmation. It could not, and it should not have. There was still a significant amount of work to be done on multiple fronts simultaneously. On the legal front, the documentation of the confirmed identification needed to be formally processed and shared with all relevant agencies. The active federal arrest warrant for Marisol, the warrant that had been issued in 1999 and had never been lifted, needed to be reviewed in the context of the new information about Camila's location and status. There were questions about jurisdiction, about extradition possibilities, about the legal pathway forward regarding Marisol, who was still believed to be in Mexico. On the human front, Camila needed time. She needed space. She needed to be given the ability to process what had happened on her own terms and at her own pace, without the pressure of an immediate reunion that she had not chosen and had not been prepared for. The facilitators, both official and otherwise, who were helping to manage the transition, were careful to make clear that the pace of any contact between Camila and Eduardo would be set by Camila. She was an adult. She had rights. She had autonomy. The fact that she had been taken without her consent at the age of 2 did not diminish or override her status as a person who got to decide, now, how this went. That is the right framework. It is also, from Eduardo's perspective, an extraordinary exercise in patience for a man who had been patient for 24 years. He waited. He did not push. The investigators who spoke with him during this period describe him as someone who understood, deeply and without resentment, that the situation required him to follow Camila's lead. That whatever she needed to process this, whatever time she needed, whatever pace felt right to her, he would match it. Because the alternative was worse. The alternative was pushing too hard and having her pull back, and that was not something Eduardo was willing to risk. The first contact, when it happened, was a phone call, arranged through intermediaries, facilitated with translation support, conducted with the knowledge and involvement of the professionals who had been guiding the process. What was said in that call is private and will remain private. That is entirely appropriate. That conversation belongs to Eduardo and to Camila and to no one else. What has been shared publicly is that it happened, that it lasted longer than the initial facilitators had expected, that by the end of it, both Eduardo and Camila had agreed to speak again. That second conversation led to a third, and slowly, in the way that all genuinely new relationships are built, something began to shape between a father and a daughter who were strangers to each other in almost every practical sense, and yet connected by biology and by history, and by a story that neither of them had fully chosen. The formal public announcement came in the form of a joint press release from the Harwick Police Department and the FBI field office. It confirmed the identification, confirmed the DNA match, confirmed the reunion, and provided the timeline of the investigative steps that had led to the result. The statement from the chief of the Harwick PD was direct and measured. He said that his department's detectives and officers continued to work every unresolved case regardless of how much time had passed. He said that the absence of leads at any given moment was not the same as the absence of a future path forward. He said that this case was proof of that. Detective Kellstrom was named in the release. The work of Arden Genomics was acknowledged. The cooperation of Mexican authorities was noted with appreciation. Eduardo Vega was not quoted at his own request. He had spoken with the department and the FBI. He had cooperated with every step of the process. But he did not want to speak to the press. He wanted to talk to his daughter. That was the only conversation he was interested in. The public response to the announcement was significant. Local media in Connecticut picked it up immediately, and within a day or two it had spread to national outlets. People who follow missing persons cases, who follow forensic genealogy, who followed the particular intersection of cold case investigation and modern technology took notice. The Arden Genomics press release, which came out a day after the police announcement, added context about the broader initiative the company was part of. They described a program to address hundreds of unresolved missing minor cases in the national database, cases where conventional investigative methods had reached their limits and where advanced DNA analysis represented the best remaining path. They noted that Camila's case was one of the older cases in the active database and that her recovery represented a proof of concept for what the combination of renewed investigative attention and cutting-edge forensics could accomplish even in cases where decades had passed. There was a line in that Arden Genomics statement that I keep coming back to because I think it captures something essential about what this case means beyond just the specifics of one family story. The company noted that Eduardo Vega had never stopped filing updates with the Harwick Police Department, that every year, on the anniversary of Camila's disappearance, he had submitted something to the department, some note, some piece of new information if he had it, or if he did not have new information, simply a statement that he had not given up, and that the case was not closed in his mind. 23 consecutive anniversary updates, 23 October 19ths, each one its own small act of refusal to accept the silence as a final answer. Detective Kellstrom said it was those updates that stayed with her most when she first opened the file. Not the complexity of the case, not the international dimension, not even the heartbreak of the original disappearance. It was those annual notes, piling up year after year in the file, each one a reminder that somewhere outside the walls of the department, a man was counting the years. She said that when she picked up the file, she felt like she owed him an answer. Not because the department had failed exactly. They had done what they could with the tools they had, but because new tools now existed to do more, and that made it a moral obligation to try. That framing, the idea that new tools create new obligations, is one that is going to become increasingly important in missing persons work over the coming years. The forensic genealogy revolution is still relatively young. The databases are still growing. The techniques are still being refined. There are hundreds of cases, maybe thousands, where a detective picking up an old file with fresh eyes and current technology could find a thread that was invisible in the year the case was opened. The question is whether there are enough Kellstroms, enough detectives willing to go back to old files, to spend the time that this kind of work requires, to follow threads through social media graphs and genealogical databases with the patience and the method that produces results. It is not glamorous work. It does not produce the adrenaline of an active investigation. It requires sitting with old pain, with files full of things that didn't pan out, with the accumulated weight of years of a family's grief. It requires the particular kind of stubbornness that does not give up just because the obvious doors are closed. But when it works, it produces moments like the one Eduardo Vega had on a Thursday in 2024, when a detective told him that his daughter was alive, and that she was 26 years old, and that she was living in a city in central Mexico, and that she had agreed to take his call. Now let us think carefully about the other person at the center of this story. Not Eduardo, whose position we can understand clearly, not Camila, whose perspective deserves its own patient consideration. Let us think about Marisol. The active federal arrest warrant for Marisol, issued in 1999, was never dissolved. It has legal force. She is believed to be in Mexico, in the same general area as Camila, though her precise location at any given time is not a matter of public record. Marisol would be in her 50s now, roughly. She has lived for 25 years as a person who took a child who was not legally hers to take, crossed an international border, and built a life in another country. Whatever her reasons were in 1999, whatever the circumstances of the separation from Eduardo, whatever she told herself about why what she did was justified or necessary, she made a choice that removed a 2-year-old from her father's life for 24 years. The legal question of what happens to Marisol is unresolved as of the time this episode was produced. Extradition between the United States and Mexico is possible but complicated, and the specifics of whether and how that process will move forward in this case are not part of the public record yet. The human question, the question of what Camila feels about the woman who raised her, is one that only Camila can answer, and she has not answered it publicly. That is her right. Whatever the legal and moral dimensions of what Marisol did, she was also the person who raised Camila, who fed her and clothed her and put her through school, who was there for whatever the significant moments of Camila's childhood and adolescence were. The relationship between them is not simple, and it cannot be made simple by the fact that Marisol committed a crime in creating it. These are the kinds of knots that parental abduction cases leave behind, even after the resolution. Maybe especially after the resolution, because the resolution does not undo the life that was lived. It does not erase Camila's memories or her attachments or her sense of home. It adds a new layer to a foundation that was already built, and the person who has to figure out how to stand on that complicated foundation is Camila herself. That is an enormous thing to ask of a 26-year-old woman who had no say in any of the circumstances that led her here. What does Camila do with the knowledge that she was taken, that the father she grew up without was not absent by choice, not dangerous, not someone who abandoned her, but someone who spent literally every year of her life looking for her? What does she do with the years that cannot be given back, the childhood memories Eduardo was not part of, the birthdays and the school plays and the ordinary Tuesday afternoons that accumulated into a life that he was never allowed to witness? What does Eduardo do with the same knowledge from his side? What does he do with the fact that she grew up, that she is an adult with her own fully formed identity, that the daughter he lost was a toddler, and the daughter he found is a woman he does not yet know? There is grief in the reunion as well as joy. That is not a contradiction. That is what it actually looks like when something this complex resolves, not with a clean restoration, but with a complicated new beginning that carries all the weight of everything that came before it. I think about what it must have been like for Camila to hear for the first time that her father had filed an update with the Harwick Police Department every single year on October 19th. That for 23 years, a man she had no memory of had been marking the anniversary of her disappearance by submitting a note to a police department in a state she did not grow up in, saying, in whatever words he used, "I have not stopped. She is still missing. I am still here." I think about what that information does to a person, to a young woman who may have been told in whatever version of the story she was given that her father was gone or indifferent or absent, to discover that the absence was not his, that for every one of those 23 October 19ths he had been counting. That is not a small thing to absorb. It might be one of the largest things a person can be asked to absorb. There is a wider lens through which this case deserves to be seen as well, and it is the lens of the hundreds of other cases like it that have not yet resolved. The National Missing Persons Database contains entries that span decades. There are names in that system that were entered in the 1980s, in the 1970s, in the 1960s. There are families that have been waiting longer than Eduardo waited. There are cases where the person who was taken is no longer a child and is no longer young and may not even be alive. The initiative that Arden Genomics described, the effort to work through the database of unresolved missing minor cases using advanced DNA analysis and renewed investigative attention, is one of the most meaningful applications of forensic technology that exists right now. Not because every case will resolve the way Camila's did. They will not. Some trails are too cold. Some people do not want to be found or do not know they need to be found. Some cases will end in tragedy rather than reunion. But some will end the way this one did. And those endings matter, not just to the families involved, but to the broader project of refusing to accept that the passage of time means the passage of accountability. Cold cases are not closed cases. That is not just a departmental slogan. It is a commitment. It is a statement about what we owe to the people who have been waiting, and the people who have been missing, and the children who were taken before they were old enough to know what was being taken from them. Camila Vega was taken on October 19, 1999. She was 2 years old. She was found alive and building her own adult life 24 years later because a detective picked up an old file and a DNA lab ran a test, and a father had never, not once in 23 years, failed to mark the anniversary of the day she disappeared. That is the story, and that is, in the end, what the story means. Not just that the technology worked, not just that the detective was skilled, but that the father was stubborn, that he kept filing, that he kept marking the date, that he did not allow the silence to convince him that the silence was permanent. And somewhere in Verano, Mexico, a 26-year-old woman picked up a phone and heard a voice she had no memory of, a voice that had been waiting 24 years to reach her, and she did not hang up. She stayed on the line. That is where we are. That is where this story stands as of the time this episode was produced. The legal process regarding Marisol is ongoing. The relationship between Eduardo and Camila is new and fragile and full of the particular awkwardness and tenderness of two people who love each other in the abstract and are only now learning each other in the specific. The questions that cannot be answered yet are still out there, waiting for the time and the conversations that will begin to address them. But Camila is alive. Eduardo knows where she is. They have spoken more than once now, and they have chosen to keep speaking. After 24 years of silence in one direction and searching in the other, there is now a line open between them. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, almost everything. If this story stayed with you, If you found yourself caring about Eduardo and Camila and the decades-long distance between them that one detective and one DNA test finally closed, please take a second to subscribe to this channel and leave a like on this video. Cases like this one deserve more attention than the news cycle gives them, and every subscription helps us keep telling these stories with the care and the depth they require. We will be back soon with another case that has been waiting for someone to slow down long enough to really look at it. Until then, cold is not the same as closed, and 24 years is a long time to wait for a Thursday.